Welcome to this session, the keynote speaker session, where we shall have a few renowned individuals presenting to us, and we're looking forward to it. Their complete biographies will be posted on the website, of course, and you may see all the details there. Here I will simply introduce them with a few words, so that I will be able to give them more time for their presentation. And we have several presenters. First of all, Michael Allen Seeve. Secondly, Nikolas Economides. Thirdly, Cheng-Few Lee. And fourthly, George Bitros. So these four gentlemen will be our presenters today. And we shall start with our own, of course, Michael Allen Seeve, who has an extensive knowledge in both leadership and industry. He is president of Mountain Development Corporation, and he's also the chairman of the board of William Paterson University. With that said, we give the floor to Michael Allen Seeve.
Good morning. Thank you. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here with so many accomplished and distinguished speakers, and I'm delighted that this panel and this program has come off so well, and it dovetails a tiny bit with what I was proposing to speak about, which is commercial real estate, which is the industry in which my firm has holdings, particularly in New York City, and the impact of technology and the confluence of the response to the pandemic and what it's all meant for the industry and industry practice. And I just want to say, as a point, that having a conference that spans the globe, spans time zones, spans so many outstanding speakers who sort of are all coordinated and are able to speak together on something like this is really, it's sort of a testament to the changes that are going on in the way that we communicate and use space and coordinate our efforts. So that said, my firm owns commercial real estate. We develop it, we buy it, and it's primarily multi-tenanted office buildings. And we have assets throughout the northeast part of the United States, and in particular in Manhattan, which is one of the great real estate markets in the country. So as many people have observed, there's been advent in all kinds of interesting technological advances that have impacted on the way that people use real estate, the way people transact for real estate, value real estate, the experience between the end user and the landlord in places like Manhattan. But the pandemic had such an amazing impact on real estate. It's accelerated all those things in ways that I think are interesting and telling, not just for real estate, but for a lot of industries. First, I'll tell you that the experience from a leadership standpoint when the pandemic began was really fascinating in New York. For many, many, many years, the experience in New York is very intermediated. If I was a tenant and I was looking for space, I would hire a real estate broker who would canvass the market, and I would hire lawyers to help me negotiate agreements, and I would help architects to help me quantify the space that I'm going to use and whether it's the right amount of space and whether I've deployed my people effectively. And landlords, likewise, were arrayed with a host of different professionals that help guide decision-making and protect their interests and make sure that in their negotiations with any given tenant that they didn't sort of violate the integrity and the obligations they had to the balance of their tenants and the buildings. But when the pandemic hit, our experience, and I don't think we were unique at all, is that all those layers of professionals kind of melted away. And it was really very much a principal to principal kind of experience because we were dealing with totally new territory. We were dealing with issues that even if we had 500-page leases, by and large, were not contemplated in those leases. And we were dealing with very human issues, not, in our view, so much the allocation of risk or liability, but really personal issues about, hey, is it safe to come back? Is it safe to use the space? How do we accommodate each other through this, unprecedented event? What does it mean for landlords and tenants? So I think one of the things that makes New York City such a great market, and one of the reasons why normally so many companies want to be in New York, is because of the connectivity. It's because you can walk down the street, you can walk into another building, you can have lunch someplace, and you're bound to bump into people that you could have some connection with from an industry and a commerce standpoint. The city is just so rich with active people, with interesting companies, with means, with dynamic plans for the future. The connectivity is so integral. So in a sense, all that comes to halt with the pandemic when nobody's coming to their office. But in another sense, it really forced people together to connect. So in our experience, and I say this from a leadership standpoint, the first thing we did was really connect with all of our tenants and understand what the pandemic meant for them, understand if we and they needed to come to some sort of financial accommodation, understand how we could sort of adapt the way that our agreements and their use of the space, if it needed to be modified or could be modified or should be modified, all with an eye towards the long term, all with an eye towards putting ourselves in a position to say, hey, however long this lasts, and obviously it lasted vastly longer than we ever expected, how do we move forward? And then, you know, for those that are invested in New York, obviously one of the great things about New York City on a normalized basis is the traffic on the street. It's intense, it's robust, it sort of spans socio and economic, from one array to another. And it came to basically a grinding halt at the pandemic. So for most landlords that have invested, capital and time and energy in filling their retail spaces with sort of the tenants that could help create the right environment for their buildings and create the right environment on the street, all that came to a halt. There was negligible retail business. These are expensive commitments on both parts. So it was sort of a fascinating example of leadership as well for tenants and landlords to sort of come together, understand what this all means. How does our business work if there is no business? How do we accommodate each other so that when this is over, we're well positioned going forward? And how do we handicap this? Is this a 3-week period? Is this a 3-month period? Certainly nobody anticipated it would last as long as it did. But our experience and our sense of the market in New York is that there was sort of a remarkable bit of cooperation between those parties, and it's sort of what makes the market so interesting. And I think it's leadership across the board. It's the relationships. It's people who are so invested in New York that they're able to look at the long term and say to themselves and say to their partners and say to their capital partners and their banks, let's ignore this quarter. Let's ignore the short-term drag on our balance sheets. Let's look at this investment we've made in this amazing business environment and how do we move it forward. So I think it's a great takeaway from the pandemic. I think the city is starting to recover. Each week is stronger than the week before. Everyone sees a ton of business travel. We have a building right in Midtown, right on Bryant Park at the corner of 40th and 6th, and it's full. It's not only fully leased, but it's occupied with people who are finding ways to work. We'll touch on how they're working a little differently later on, but it speaks to the resiliency. It speaks to, what a strong business community and how a strong business community can sort of work together to navigate in sort of really uncertain times. But with that backdrop, I think real estate is the classic business that for years was slow to adopt technology for so many reasons, the least of which is it's a slow moving business. It's a long cycle. It's a long sales cycle. It's a long, development cycle. Many people who like to own real estate like to own it over a really long time. So the mindset is not always to be an early adopter of technology, but it's hard for me to think of a business that's been as impacted by technology, particularly in the face of the pandemic, as real estate. The first is obviously what we're doing right now. Years ago, no one would ever have dreamed that you could operate an office remotely. It's sort of inconceivable. But to a tenant, and I'm talking about the hundreds of companies in our portfolio, all of them adapted. All of them learned to use Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Google Meets and all these other things to sort of communicate. So wherever they were, business didn't stop. And it's an amazing thing. Every time you get on a panel, and I'm usually the one someone has a hard time figuring out if they're muted or not, but it was such a technological leap And the entire world did it simultaneously. The entire business world really threw themselves into it. So what it does from a real estate standpoint is it really changes the geography. Whereas formerly, companies would locate themselves in a way that was perhaps equidistant from all their employees, or designed to be convenient for employees that are commuting all the time, or really just designed to be a destination where they would be able to attract future employees based on their proximity to things like competitors and higher education and hotels and event space and the things that drive business. Now, the ability to communicate like this electronically is totally changed the dynamic. And obviously, from an efficiency standpoint, I think one of the first things that companies are looking at is how much time were my employees spending commuting, and is that still going to be a productive use of their time going forward? In New York, where we are, many, significant portion of the employee base migrates into the city from the suburbs around the perimeter. And there are many great ways to get there, but there are no quick ways to get there. So whether it's driving or public transportation, it's a commitment in time. And if it's public transportation, it's really a double commitment in time, because you need to schedule yourself around the availability of that transportation. So one of the first things that I think a lot of employers realized when the world switched to this sort of virtual communication is that there was more time that was just going to be available for people if they weren't commuting to spend working and doing other things. And it's a fascinating concept, and it's sort of something that I think would have been very hard to imagine 5 years ago. But now, throughout our portfolio, nearly every company is contemplating some sort of hybrid work, which is meant to allow their people to come to the office and have the connection that they need in the office, to take advantage of the services in the office, to do the work that's only doable in the office, to sort of entertain meetings, but also to work remotely. And whether that means working at home, whether that means working in a satellite office, whether that means working in a co-working environment, it's really entirely changed the way people view space. And it's a significant impact. And I think an interesting one and a fascinating one. And I think one that, to the extent that you measure these decisions by productivity, makes for a vastly more productive workforce if it's handled properly. Another fascinating impact of technology on the commercial workspace are, the use of apps as a communication tool. Traditionally, when landlords and tenants evaluated space, the connection was very segmented. Oftentimes, you had landlords and you had the chief executive or the chief financial officer of a company talking about rents and what's an appropriate financial commitment for our company and how much space will that solve for, and how do we come up with lease terms that are appropriate for us and appropriate for you. And generally speaking, there was a contact who was the point person for the tenant, often a human relations person, and their job would be to communicate with the landlord and make known, interests on behalf of the tenants. Hey, we'd like the space cleaned differently, or we want to use, a gym if it's available, or we want to know what the future plans are for the, the retail space. But it was very segmented and it was very narrow. And one of the fascinating things that's been a real advent in technology is the use of apps to track the use of buildings by the end users. So there are many players in the space, but there are apps now that people sign up for. They are used to grant you access to a building. So instead of carrying a swipe key or a set of keys, you're able to use your iPhone or your Android, present your credentials and enter the building. You're able to communicate directly with your landlord's representatives and send them messages that say, hey, it's too hot in my space or it's too cold. You're able to communicate with other people in the building and make reservations to use the building conference room or use the gym. You are able to track all of the different features of the building and communicate with your landlord. And conversely, the landlord is now the recipient of data that they never would have gotten before. So whereas formerly, if one was a landlord, you'd be relying upon your contacts at the tenant, the HR leader or the CFO, to report back and say, hey, my colleagues and I really like the building conference room, or, we think it's too hot. Now you have vastly more data And if you put yourself in the shoes of a landlord with very large tenant commitments, so not an office of 10 people, but an office of 500 people or an office of 700 people, you're now aggregating an intense amount of data that informs the way you operate the building, that helps you really understand the tenant experience and helps you make, we think, much smarter decisions about capital allocation. If nobody is using the gym, and it seemed like a good idea when you were negotiating the lease, but now that you're the beneficiary of all this information that never would have been available before, you're in a much stronger position and an ability vastly more responsive than you ever could have been. It's a fascinating thing, and in today's world where people are so connected electronically, it's really, I think, changed the way end users and landlords are able to think about space. Another sort of interesting and impactful way that people use space is the cloud for storage. Traditionally, when you went into space and you thought about how you were going to array yourself there, it's a combination of where am I going to put my employees and which departments need to be next to each other and which executives need to be close to each other, and are they close to their files? Are they close to the documents that they're going to need, for any given transaction? And when you think particularly about professionals like accountants and law firms, their ability to put client documents in front of the professionals that need to evaluate them and report back to a client it's a measure of their efficiency as a firm. But today, the cloud and the use of the cloud for document storage has really revolutionized that experience. The days of people keeping files outside their office, or the classic thing of tenants that pile files on their windowsill because they want to access them, that's really disappeared. Because you can access any document you want electronically. You can share it electronically. You can make it available to your colleagues with whom you're collaborating, so you can all look at it and edit it and revise it and look at it at the screen at the same time. And it doesn't just go for documents of the written word. In our business where you're dealing with construction and plans and specifications, it's an unbelievable tool. It creates amazing efficiencies. And it's reduced radically the need for space. All of the space that once went to file cabinets is often gone. All of the space that sort of once went to huge oversized conference rooms where you needed to get 40 people in the conference room, that's really become a rarity. Now you can work in smaller groups. You can do it efficiently. You can do it simultaneously. It's really changed the way people work. And we think it's changed the way people work for the better. Another fascinating and interesting thing about the market and about the way people transact is the access to data. Traditionally, information about availability in a building and about prevailing leasing terms and about the schedule of future availabilities was sort of a closely guarded secret by landlords and by the professionals that represent tenants, in part because they wanted to control the market and they wanted to sort of control their environments, and for the tenant professional side, because that was part of the value proposition for their customers, that they were going to be able to deliver data to them that was not readily available. They'd be able to analyze it. They would rely upon their personal connections and their years of experience in the industry to present opportunities and alternatives that the end user might not be aware of. But just as apps with the tenant experience have really changed the way that landlords become responsive, apps that track space usage, lease expirations, prevailing market terms, all of that has really become ascendant. And if anything, more so during the pandemic, because people are so reliant on data. They're not able to walk down the street and walk into their colleague's office necessarily and ask for it, but they need to know it. And now people are able to sort of report in on it. So you've got all kinds of users feeding information into this sort of ever dynamic database about space availability. So if I have a space commitment in a constrained market like New York, and I'm trying to think 2 years out about what are my options, I don't necessarily need to engage professionals. I have the ability now to go online to sort of search the availability of space, to determine what the opportunities might be, what I might expect from a financial standpoint commitment, not only in terms of rent, but lease terms, in terms of related costs, such as construction costs and concessions and downtime. It's made the market vastly more transparent. And in some respects, there are professionals who probably don't welcome that. But taken as a whole, I think it makes for a much stronger market. The transparency makes for greater confidence. It makes for smoother transactions. It makes for quicker transactions. It makes for a vastly more informed customer base. And it's created, I think, an environment that's very appropriate to markets like New York, where very informed people with very significant companies are able to make the best decisions because they're able to rely on the most amount of information. So I saved a little bit of time at the end, Professor Malindretos, if there's any questions, but I wanted to say that looking back on the pandemic and looking back on the impact of technology, and we're certainly not out of the pandemic, and I certainly don't mean to convey that to anyone, but I think in many respects, there are many great lessons that can be taken from the commercial real estate experience in New York. I think there are tremendous stories of landlords and tenants that solve sometimes very complicated, sometimes very significant financial questions as between themselves without needing to rely or resort to litigation or third-party dispute resolution, really dealing principle to principle as the best sort of decisions are made, dealing sort of in unprecedented territory, but doing it in a very efficient, forward-thinking, long-term mindset, and doing it in a way that's now allowing New York to really recover, to refill its buildings, to refill its streets, to have its retailers start to enjoy the kind of traffic that they need to run their businesses, and for people who walk on the streets of New York to see the kinds of retailers that make the experience appropriate for them. I think the way that people use space, I think companies are able to think very critically and very productively about the way space can best work for their companies, the way their employees best communicate, collaborate, share information, share documents, and ultimately produce for themselves and for their clients. And I think in a way that might not have happened had it not been for the pandemic. There are so many end user apps and technologies that are now part of the market that really make for just a much more informed consumer base. Landlords know more about how their tenants are using buildings. Buildings are now able to end users are now able to communicate much more directly with their landlords. Space users are able to access vastly more data about availabilities in the market and prevailing terms. And all taken together, it's really been an amazing impact on the industry. So that's what I wanted to chat about. John, Dr. Malindretos, is that anything for the group for questions?
Thank you very much, Michael. It was.
I have one question.
I don't know why it's doing that.
I am George Bitros from Athens, Greece.
Good morning.
How are you? Okay.
Well, thank you.
Someone has YouTube open? Someone? No?
I hear an echo in my ears, but shall I?
Someone from the audience probably has YouTube open, connected simultaneously, so I kindly ask to shut it down. Okay, go ahead.
Is there going to be a surplus of space due to this technology in New York? One. And do you hear of any complaints about this technology of communication? Because there must be some disadvantages, and probably the speed of communication has increased, and slow-moving people may complain about it.
So our sense is that in the near term, there's definitely going to be more available space than there has been in a while. I think a lot of the things that we talked about give rise to companies using less space than they did before. So by definition, that should put more space on the market. On the other hand, though, we think that space will be absorbed in relatively due course. Our experience has been that one of the dilemmas in New York has been not enough space, and not enough space on a timely basis. So large companies would have to lease space 2 years in advance of a lease expiration, because if they didn't, they wouldn't have the opportunity to transition into space. And it created real inefficiencies and inconveniences and things that I think were a real turnoff for business users in New York. I think there's a healthy amount of swing space in the market makes for a more efficient market. It makes for a market that's better for end users. And ultimately, if end users are frustrated because there isn't space, like oftentimes there was before the pandemic, it would force them to sort of adopt different kinds of strategies. And as for the adoption of technology, I think you're exactly right. There are some people that don't enjoy it and would prefer something else. But I do think with their colleagues, with the support of everybody else, you know, they'll come on board.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Professor Economides, you have a question?
Yes, I do. I guess my question is, how do you see, and not only in New York, but in general, the way technology has been crucial in real estate? And I mean, there are some sectors, for example, even the banking sector, which are way behind in technology. And I hope I don't insult my banking friends here. But there are, I wonder, I mean, you mentioned technology in many ways and how it affects consumers, businesses, employees, and so on. I wonder to what extent you see technology being crucial in intermediation. I do platforms, and I'm keenly interested in the issue of intermediation. So I wonder if you see the technology becoming crucial in intermediation.
I do. I think real estate is a funny business because there are so many tasks that are things one would take for granted in real estate, where technology removes things that once you see how efficient they are, it's a wonder they existed beforehand. A classic example when you're buying and selling real estate is a title search. You know, you go through the records to make sure that your ownership and the previous ownership is what it's represented to be, and that there are no liens or encumbrances or mortgages or anything that would impair title. And up until recently, that was a function of professionals literally going to the offices, searching through the old records, reading old documents and making sure the metes and bounds of a property were what they were supposed to be. It's a very quaint but old-fashioned kind of experience. And because so much of it relied on individual human beings researching individual records and checking them, it opens itself up to sort of delays and innocent errors. With technology now, that kind of review can be completed so quickly, so accurately. The record keeping is so much easier because it's not manual and hard copies. The data that's available when you look at title is actually incredibly important. And the more time that parties have to really review that data, as opposed to spending time asking people to find it and search for it, it's enormously impactful, and yet it's sort of a very minor, modest part of a normal real estate transaction that one would not think about. But it's a reminder of how powerful the technology can be to touch so many aspects of the business.
Thank you very much.
Are there other questions for Mr. Seeve for that very interesting presentation which he has made? I have learned a lot the last half hour.
Jan Takmatsidis is asking.
Okay. Professor Takmatsidis.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, very informative. I was wondering, the interplay between leadership and management is well established and appreciated. I was wondering, and allow me to extrapolate the issue. In this time, nowadays, with this extra and quite speedy technological advancement, would you consider management as a system, as a more systemic approach, or leadership as a more creative structure on management more important? Leadership or management, what would be better to refine in this challenging maybe period, in this transforming period? Thank you.
You know, I would say management. I think the best leaders are the ones that create processes, that create a system for the people on the front lines to sort of inform their colleagues and inform themselves and inform decision making. So, you look at the real estate business, which is sort of interesting in that there are so many role players: leasing people, construction people, finance people, management people, air conditioning people, electrical people. Ultimately, the leader of these kinds of companies can't possibly enjoy expertise in any of those areas. And in most areas, in many of them, you need to rely almost entirely on the people who have that expertise. So the best use of technology, I think, by leaders is finding ways to push that dialogue to the forefront so that everyone gets the benefit of what their colleagues are thinking or where their colleagues are coming out on an issue. And so that when decisions are taken, they're taken with the benefit of everybody's input. Otherwise, you're leaving strengths and assets on the table.
Thank you, Michael, for this fascinating presentation and very informative one. We shall move forward to our next speaker, Professor Nikolas Economides, who is an internationally recognized academic authority on network economics, electronic commerce, and public policy. Please welcome Professor Economides.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. I will move quickly to my presentation. Here we are. I hope I can do it right. Hold on.
Click the...
there we are.
Here.
Yeah. Okay, so one more. Okay, so I want to talk about investigation of tech giants and privacy. Okay, so for a long time there were no significant antitrust issues in the tech sector, but recently there have been multiple interests and multiple interventions. There have been congressional hearings on the tech giants and specifically on Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and a number of antitrust suits have been filed under the present law, while Congress itself is discussing the possibility of a new antitrust law as well. So let me go into a bit of a detail on that. And I'll start with the cases which are the weakest. The allegations against Microsoft, the main issue has been that it's selling its own brands in competition with third-party brands in its virtual market space. That happens. There are Amazon branded products or something that has the name Amazon in there, although not really manufactured by Amazon. But even if the allegations are proved to be correct and the government wins over Microsoft, it's not an existential threat to Microsoft. It can survive and thrive completely without its own brands. So Amazon is not a huge problem in the antitrust investigations. What about the allegations against Apple? The main allegation against Apple is that it monopolizes the distribution of third-party apps. Apps that you use in iPhone can only be distributed, you can have access to them only through the Apple App Store and no other way. And because of this monopoly, Apple is able to charge a 30% distribution fee to all these app manufacturers. And the second allegation, mainly in the EU and some countries of the EU specifically, is that Apple gives preference to its own apps over third-party apps. My assessment is that eventually Apple is going to lose on both of these fronts. But even so, these are not existential threats. Apple makes a lot of money from the appliances, the phones, and even though in recent years it has made a lot more money from services, still even if the services were eliminated or reduced, the profitability of the services reduced substantially, it would still be fine. So let's go to the more difficult situations for companies. The lawsuits against Google. The Department of Justice has filed a lawsuit late last year alleging monopolization. The Attorney Generals of Colorado and other states filed a similar lawsuit alleging, again, monopolization. The Attorney General of Texas and other states not only alleged monopolization, but alleged price fixing. Price fixing is making an agreement with other companies, and I'll explain exactly how this price fixing is alleged to have happened in the ads market. And the EU and private actions have been there for some time on tying in the Android phones. And there is also a private action on the 30% fee that Android app, the Google charges for Android apps in distribution. Okay, let me go into these allegations. These are very, very serious allegations. In my opinion, they're an existential threat to Google. The one that has potentially the most devastating effect is the case of the Attorney General of Texas, because it alleges price fixing between Google and Facebook in allocating who wins the business, who wins a business in the ads market. So essentially, the Texas case alleges that Google runs ad exchanges and participates in both sides of the market, both in supply and demand, and practice which is obviously disallowed in financial exchanges, but obviously not disallowed yet in the ads exchanges. Now, price fixing is a very, very serious allegation because the way antitrust law is written in the United States, you do not need to show adverse effects. An agreement of cooperation, a collusion between companies is enough to put them in jail. So if Texas allegations are correct and are proven, Google will have an extremely hard time defending itself. Could lead to a breakup of Google, could also lead to rules that would not allow Google running ads and the ads exchange and participating both on supply and demand side. So this is a very serious threat for Google. Let me go to the fourth company I wanted to discuss, Facebook. The Federal Trade Commission and private actions have alleged, private lawsuits have alleged, first, monopolization, second, that Facebook did defensive mergers with Instagram and WhatsApp. If successful, this action of the Federal Trade Commission could lead to a breakup of Facebook and a spin-off of Instagram and WhatsApp, which is going to be unprecedented in the sense that Instagram and WhatsApp have been almost for 10 years within Facebook, but it could lead to a forced spin-off of these applications. And another threat that is, in my opinion, an even bigger threat, even a bigger existential threat for Facebook, is that the government can impose forced interoperability with competing social networks. Like, I don't know how much you know of the history of telecommunications, but if before 1934, the telecommunications networks in the United States were disconnected. AT&T had its own network, other companies had their own networks, and they couldn't communicate with each other. With 1935, regulation imposed interoperability. So now you can be a customer of any telephone company and talk to all the customers of all the other telephone companies. That can happen in the social network. So you can have your Facebook account and whatever interactions you have be portable to another competing social network. And if that happens, Facebook is going to be in very real trouble. It's an existential threat for Facebook. Now, what about the new antitrust law? I think a new antitrust law would have a difficulty getting political consensus. Congress is way too divided and probably will remain way too divided for the next 4 years. So it's very difficult to pass a new law under those circumstances. Additionally, there is a bigger problem that the antitrust law is a general law. It applies to all businesses. So you cannot just make it just for digital platforms because you think this is a major problem. You can't just do it for that. You have to. It has to be for all industries, for pharmaceuticals, real estate, steel, and so on, all industries. So what might end up happening is not a new antitrust law, but a new regulatory system for digital markets. And this is the approach that more or less the European Union has taken through the recent last year's digital markets regulation. Now, I want to talk about something that I have been researching in recent times, and this is the issue of the personal acquisition of information by digital platforms. And this is work that I have done jointly with Professor Ioannis Lianos, who is from UCL, University College London, and currently the head of the Hellenic Competition Commission in Athens. So we have written 3 papers, but take a look at the first title, Giving Away Our Data for Free is a Market Failure. So this is kind of the summary of what I want to talk about for the remaining of the time. How the digital platforms acquire your data, yours and mine, without paying. And the other articles say similar things, but in a more sophisticated way, number 2 and number 3. Okay, so I'm going to talk about market failure in this market for personal information. So what do I mean? Well, take Google and Facebook now. First of all, we know that both Google and Facebook are dominant in their respective markets. Google in internet search, Facebook similarly dominant in social networks. So there's no doubt that they are the dominant firms with very big market shares. Now, what do these platforms do? By default, they collect personal information from users. What kind of personal information? Internet protocol address, your IP address of your router, your home and office location, your search history, likes in Facebook, uploaded information in Facebook, and so on. So this data, they take it, they combine it with other data, for example, health data that they might purchase from hospitals, as well as public data that is provided by the census in an aggregate form, and create a customer profile that they then sell to advertisers and marketing companies, political campaigns, and so on. So I'll talk about it as if I'm talking about Google, but Facebook analysis would be similar. So when users use Google Internet Search or Chrome, by default, they opt in. There is a long page with terms that nobody reads, and once they are in, their personal information is collected by Google. Now, in principle, there are 2 markets, 2 different markets. One, internet search, and Google sells you that information, gives it to you for free, but think of it as a market in which they could potentially charge a positive price. And the second market is an opposite direction buying and selling, in which Google can buy your personal information. But what happens right now is that there is a contract that you have with Google by entering that market, in which the contract says that the user cannot buy internet search if he or she does not sell her or his information to Google. So having 2 separate markets in principle, internet search market and personal information search market, have been collapsed to a single market by Google and Facebook. And both of these transactions happen at 0 price. And this is what I call, and economists call, a market failure. So instead of having these markets operate and have prices and so on, the companies have imposed a take it or leave it requirement to provide the personal information at 0 price, and this means a market failure. And this happens despite the fact that there is a lot of variation in the willingness to pay. For example, if you look at the willingness to pay of a user for internet search, and let's call it X, that varies a lot. It can be high, it can be low, depends if what you are, who you are as a consumer. Second, the willingness to sell a user personal information from you to Google also varies a lot. Let's call it Z, but well, I mean, some people care about their privacy, so they are not willing to sell. Some people don't care about their privacy, are willing to sell at a very low price. And then there is a third variable here that is important. It's how much the information is worth to Google. Your information might be worth low or high to you, but the way Google sees it is a different story. Google might be willing to pay a lot or a little about this. So here you have three different dimensions of variability, and Google has collapsed them to a single price. A functioning market would exhibit a lot of variation in the willingness to pay and sell for personal information and the willingness to buy by Google. So we have a market failure. What happens is that Google provides the free search in exchange for acquisition of private user information. And similarly, Facebook provides free use in exchange for acquisition of private user information. And this zero price that has been imposed is arbitrary and underlines the market failure in the market for private user information. Now, presently, the United States, sorry, not the United States, the European Union and the state of California have privacy regulation, but the privacy regulations they have are based on rights of users, and they're not based on issues of antitrust and market failure. So, again, in a competitive market, there would be different transactions. Google might be paying some people, might not be paying some people, similarly for Facebook, and so on. But keep in mind that because Google knows so much about you, if the market started working, it might be able to implement near perfect price discrimination as a monopsonist because of how much information he knows about you. So he can affect the market by giving you a low price because he knows a lot about you. And therefore, issues of market operation and efficiency arise because of Google's dominance. Now, once we understand the interaction between the user and Facebook and Google as a market interaction, then we can apply antitrust. So we know that the buyer here in the information market, Google or Facebook, is a dominant firm, and therefore we can establish that it's a monopsonist. And the buyer also knows a lot of user-specific information and can implement price discrimination. So the present world is a default of opt-in. So just by getting access to internet search by Google, you are forced to give in your information. And that's what I call an opt-in here, opt-in, the opt-in default. So what we need to do to start, suppose the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice win the cases against Facebook and Google. What should they do? I think the first thing they should do is change the default regime. So the default regime should not be opt-in, should be opt-out. What does opt-out mean? Opt-out means that Google might be able to collect your information, but they cannot legally use it unless you give them further permission. And the further permission might be contingent on you being compensated. So unless the market really works, you give them extra, they give them the opportunity to use your information and you collect some money. Now, Google has obviously no incentive to make this change. It won't make on its own a change from opt-in to opt-out. It has to be done by regulation. Additionally, even if we change from default opt-in to default opt-out, because of market dominance by Google and Facebook, these companies can overcharge users or not pay them the competitive price for the information that the users provide. So it's not sufficient to just say we're going to go to opt-out. we need to think more about it. Okay. So to restore, in a restored functioning market, some people are going to be paid for providing personal information, even if they receive a free search. Some users may prefer to pay for search and not provide information for free because they want to guard their privacy. They prefer to pay for the other service, for the internet service, and not provide information. Some of these users, some subset of these users who prefer to pay for search and not provide personal information might be willing to sell their personal information if they offered a high price. Because here, we shouldn't see the world in a very naive way in which everything happens at zero price. If the market starts operating, then it wouldn't be peculiar to have some positive prices, and some of the users who prefer not to pay for search right now would be willing to pay for search and get paid for their personal data. Now, what kind of harms, like we say in antitrust, happens? Well, to the extent that users do not receive in kind the full compensation for the personal data they provide, they are harmed. Second, there are users who would prefer to pay for search and not provide their personal information to Google, and they're also harmed because they're compelled to provide information under Google's requirement. So what is the so-called but-for world, the world without the anti-competitive practices? Well, we can define three different regimes. One is the present regime, the status quo. Default in, this is where we are, regime one. Regime two would be the but-for world, the world without the anti-competitive practices. So it would be with default opt-out, but let's keep Google as a monopolist for personal data. And regime three is a world without the anti-competitive practices, the but-for world, with default opt-out, but now many companies competing to buy your personal data. Google no more a monopolist. So the difference between regime 2 and regime 3 is that Google is no more a monopolist in regime 3, while Google is a monopolist in regime 2. So which one is the correct world without the anti-competitive practice? Now that's a hard question because the world has not been there without the anti-competitive practice. Since the beginning of internet search, Google has operated that way. It collected the information while giving you for free the search service. So which one is the correct world? In the academic work, in the papers, we show that there are significant consumer surplus gains in regime 3 compared to regimes 1 and 2. So regime 3, remember, is the one in which we have opt-out and many companies competing to buy your personal data. Okay, so the conclusion, in my opinion, of what might happen here is that the default opt-in is going to disappear. It's just a matter of time, a matter of the lawsuits getting resolved, but I don't think we're going to keep going on with the default opt-in. And because of that, I believe that we are going to see the creation of a market for selling personal data to Google and Facebook. And for some of these, for some of the customers, for some sellers here of personal information, the amount of money they're going to make is probably going to be limited, something like $5 or $10 or some small amount. But for some others, especially for celebrities, selling personal data to Google or Facebook can be extremely lucrative. I won't talk about the specifics about other remedies, but there are possibilities of some restrictions on the companies, which we call conduct remedies. And there are some possibilities of other restrictions like breakups, which we call structural remedies. And as I mentioned earlier, there is also the issue of interoperability. Okay, so let me conclude and leave some time for questions. Okay, so privacy regulation right now is a rights-based approach. And what I advocate for is antitrust approach to privacy issues and the selling and buying of information. And I believe that traditional antitrust can apply because Google and Facebook have imposed a market failure in the market for personal user information. A regulator, somebody like the Federal Trade Commission, should change the default to opt out, which means again that even if your information is collected, Google and Facebook have no legal right to use it and sell it to advertisers and so on, unless you actively authorize them to do that in a transaction. And so we should restrict the default to opt out and restrict the market power of Google and Facebook in implementing price discrimination towards users, which are sellers of personal information. And that's all I have to say on this. I'm sorry I covered a lot of things very quickly. I hope I wasn't too fast, but I will be very happy to hear your questions and go back to any issue you might want.
Thank you, Professor Economides, for your presentation, which was informative and useful. I have a question, if I may. By the way, there is an echo going on at some point, so please mute your YouTube if you have a YouTube open or something like that. And the question is, will this regulation alteration that will happen to opt out, which you feel will happen because they are a monopoly power, you think that will affect negatively their valuations in the future?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is more complicated. I think it will depend on how much money Google and Facebook would have to pay. And given the amount of money they make, I actually don't think the amount of money they're going to give out to consumers is going to be a big percentage of the revenue. And although I should say, yes, the revenue is going to be, the net profit is going to be decreased a bit, I don't think it's going to be decreased very considerably by that. So they can accommodate the opt-out and so on without losing too much money. I think that the biggest threat to these companies is the actions earlier on. We talked about monopolization by the Federal Trade Commission, which can lead to a breakup of the companies, and that can have significant adverse profit implications. And also the possibility of interoperability. Right now, Facebook has a huge profit because you and your friends are there, you have your relationships, these relationships are valuable to you. The fact that you have your relationships in Facebook is very valuable to Facebook. If you could move, without losing your relationship in Facebook, move them virtually to another network, like you change phone companies easily. If you can do that under interoperability, if forced interoperability were imposed, that could be devastating for Facebook. Because instead of being a monopolist of all your connections, now they're in competition with somebody else, another social network. You are able, if you want, to take your connections and give them to the other network as well. I mean, you don't care if you are in both networks. In fact, you would like it because the other network might have more of your friends. And so that could be devastating for Facebook. But I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't be able to assign at this point the probability on how likely this is going to happen. But if it does happen, it's going to be a very, very serious competitive problem for Facebook.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Professor Economides? One more question.
Yes, please.
Professor Bitros?
Nick, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
A long time ago.
I'm glad to see you're doing well.
Yes. Thank you. Nick, Microsoft is coming very strong with an alternative search engine. Can they argue in the courts that now there is a duopoly, a sort of duopoly or some sort of competition? And why don't other networks like Yahoo get into this same business?
All right. Okay. So Microsoft has the Bing engine. In practice, the way these engines work, they're very, very, very similar. So there's a significant difference, though. Microsoft is not typically collecting this information because their business model is not based on that. And because they have been hit hard by antitrust, so they're a bit careful about doing that. Now, but in principle, just saying there exists an alternative is not good enough because the regulators will count the market shares. And they say, in Europe, for example, Google has a market share of 95% in search. In the United States, it has a market share over 75%. So when you have these very high market shares, antitrust law imposes additional obligations to those companies that are dominant, which smaller companies don't have. And that's kind of the tradition of antitrust law, the way it has evolved in the United States and Europe. So it's not enough to have an alternative product, even though in some consumers' minds, it's equally good. It might even be better. Some people might prefer Bing to Google. That's not enough. I mean, the question is, how much market power do you have because of your very large market share?
Yes.
And how much you know about the consumer, and you can sell that information to the advertisers. I don't think that Microsoft knows as much about you when you use Bing as Google knows about you when you use Google search. So there's a qualitative difference between the two, and I think Microsoft very carefully went out of its way to make sure that it does not collect information about you, your location, and so on, which it could do. It could become a competitor in that dimension to Google, but it chose not to. But in any case, I mean, the fact that there is a comparable product or a close substitute doesn't.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Nick. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Economides. Our next keynote speaker.
John, one question from Takmadzidis. He has raised hand.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you very much. A quick question for this excellent and valuable, precious presentation. Would you consider that it may be the case that regulation regarding information processing and communication appears to be more difficult than regarding commodities? Is there a genuine difficulty on that in this nowadays, or is just politics and policies?
I think there is always some difficulty when you create a regulation, and we're talking about sectoral regulation. Remember in 1935, when regulation was imposed in telecommunications, you had one very large company with over 50%, which was AT&T, and you had hundreds of smaller companies that were that the regulation said they should be able to interconnect as equals to AT&T. That required a lot of technical work to set up the standards of interoperability and things of that sort. So similarly, I think you would need to create a regulatory body. I don't see it to be sufficient to say the Federal Trade Commission will do it. You would need to create a regulatory body, something like the Federal Telecommunications Commission, but for social networks, for example. So you create this body, and then you give them the responsibility to set up the standards for interoperability. And this can be pretty sophisticated stuff, because here we're talking about malleable interfaces. At the time of 1935, everything was happening at the physical level. It was much more easy to set up, while here everything is happening at a logical level and kind of software level, so it's kind of a more difficult to set up. Not so much more difficult to set up as it needs to be set up, and the people who are running the commission should be sophisticated enough to make sure that the companies don't cheat. So anyway, the short answer to your question is yes, it does require extra effort, and in my opinion, it would ultimately require a regulatory commission. And I see the European Union going in that direction, and I think that eventually the United States will also go in that direction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Economides. We shall move to our next keynote speaker, Professor Cheng-Few Lee, who is a distinguished professor at Rutgers University and internationally recognized in the field of finance. Professor Lee was ranked the most published finance professor worldwide during the period 1953 to 2008. So we welcome Professor Cheng-Few Lee. Even though I didn't see him in the names here of the audience.
Jan, I don't think he is in, so you better move on with Professor Bitros. I don't think he is in now.
Okay. Then we shall move on to Professor Bitros, Professor Emeritus at Athens University. And he is taught at New York University and Fordham University in New York also.
Yes.
He served as chairman of the economics department of Athens University of Economics and Business. And he has many other accomplishments which are posted on the website of Icabe, and several of you, of course, know. So we welcome Professor Bitros as the next keynote speaker.
Many thanks for having me, and many thanks to Lefteris Thalassinos for organizing this very dense and very active conference, and I'm very pleased to participate. Now, Lefteris, tell me, how do I bring up my...
Okay, you want to upload your presentation? We have your presentation ready, or you want to do it yourself?
No, upload it yourself.
Okay.
Upload it.
Vasilis, will you please upload the presentation of Mr. Professor Bitros? Yes, go ahead. Okay, here we are.
A little bit bigger? Can we make it a little bit bigger?
Make full screen, Vasilis. Make it full screen. Okay.
Okay. This is a paper which I hope will bring very common news to you, but I try these common news related to the technological developments in the money space. I relate them to the institutional setup and the activities in the Athenian democracy of the 5th and 4th centuries. Now, how do we go about going page down? Okay. I will be talking about the Bitcoin, but in actuality, I will be thinking about all the digital currencies which are based on the blockchain technology. And these are very many digital currencies. They count about 3,000. And they have major advantages over paper money and money issued by central banks. You can see the advantages, contactless payments, safety like gold and silver, no issues of trust. There is no trust because the money is not issued by a central bank or a government. The supply is elastic. The supply of these currencies is elastic to prices. And when they are used widely, they will set up a fully decentralized system of payments. This is very important attribute of these currencies, and I will come back again to this point. The next, please. Okay, they have, of course, several disadvantages, but these disadvantages compared to the paper money are not very big or very strange. Rather, they argue that digital currencies are very excessive. They use excessive energy consumption. But think about all these institutions and all these mechanisms that go about issuing paper money, and there is literature which shows that if you make a cost-benefit analysis of the two currencies, you don't get this straightforward proposition that the digital currencies consume excessive amount of energy. Of course, digital currencies carry anonymity, which anonymity has certain advantages. I will talk about these advantages later on, but they also the anonymity permit tax evasion and other illicit activities, similar to the cash money that we use today. Some argue that Bitcoin has an upper bound of supply, which amounts to 21 million US dollars. But there is Ethereum and other currencies which have relaxed this upper bound. And so the balance of advantages over disadvantages is so great that a lot of people predict that in several years, digital technologies will displace paper money, the type of currencies we use up to now. And at that point, two questions will arise. The one is, will governments step in and try to retain control? Already we see signs of such tendencies. And the second question is, what kind of government intervention would serve the interest of citizens best? So I'm going to try to answer these two questions. Okay. Looking backwards over the millennia, we know that when these currencies come to the threshold of dominating our world, governments will step in and will try to control developments. But Western type democracies cannot afford to allow governments to issue their own digital currencies, because cryptocurrencies issued by governments would compromise privacy and would destroy citizen sovereignty. So I don't think that at least Western type technologies, democracies will take this route, but they will end up regulating these currencies. So what are the options that we have in the regulation of these cryptocurrencies? We have actually two options. Either the governments can embrace and promote actively their adoption, and the next is employ a combination of both, namely regulate privately, offer cryptocurrencies, and on the other hand, promote them, and adopt a combination of both, which would be a regime like we have, like the regime Nick was talking about, the Google monopsony about information. So the next slide, please. Okay, let's think of the quality of governments in democracies. Governments can be bad actors, and citizens can be bad actors. So we need an optimal regime, a regime which would protect citizens, but also protect the common good by the bad citizens. Anonymity protects citizens from bad governments, whereas transparency of payments protects the common good from bad citizens. So the question is, comes to the mind, is this: is there an example, or has there ever been one after which to pattern the solution of this policy dilemma? How do we go about to solve this dilemma of a compromise between anonymity of the currency, but also transparency of payments, so that we protect citizens from bad governments and citizens from bad citizens? How do we go about? I think, and this is the contribution I'm trying to make, I think that if we look back into the Athenian example, what the Athenian democracy did in the 5th and the 4th century regarding the management of money, we may arrive at a solution. So let me brief you very quickly as to the approach that the Athenian democracy adopted in managing the silver standard at the time. So the next slide, please. Okay, here I give you a sketch of the institutions that were involved in the management of money. First, it was the General Assembly, or the Assembly of the Citizens, which was the top institution. Below this assembly was the Council, which was the executive part of the Athenian system of governance. The temples were not only serving religious purposes, but also financial purposes. They served as lenders of last resort to the Athenian state. And then you had the treasury, you had the mint, you had the dokimasters. Dokimasters were two guys, one in Piraeus and one in Athens, in the agora places, where people brought their coins to them. They tried them, they tested them, and they had a law they followed how to keep the integrity of the Athenian drachma intact. And the mint was there and cut coins for anybody who had silver bullion. In Athens, you had parallel competition of all currencies that circulated in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. So the mint was there to cut Athenian Attic drachmas for anybody, Athenian or foreign, who wanted to cut. He had bullion and he wanted to cut Attic drachmas. Okay, let me move on. This is very difficult.
Vasily, next.
Vasilis, can you move to the next? Okay. The roles of the state in the management of the silver standard. Athens defined a unit of account, that was the drachma, linked this unit of account to a commodity, which was silver, enacted and enforce rules and regulations to safeguard the integrity of the currency. Now, I like to tell you this, which is very astonishing. I make a quick digression. In 480 BC, Athens cut the first drachmas using silver from the Lavrion mines. The drachma at the time was cut with content of 2 grams, 0.92 weight of pure silver. When the Romans entered Athens in 170 BC and they found drachma coins, they measured the content, and the drachma coins at that time, they contained 2 grams 90%, which means that over 300 years, the drachma was not debased to any significant extent. 2.92 in 480, 2.90 in 170 BC. So the integrity of the drachma actually ascertained the quality and the status of the Athenian Republic, of the Athenian democracy. Anyway, Athens did not mingle up with private markets. Markets determine the quality, the quantity, and the price ratios of different currencies that circulated in competition within the Attica space. Vasilis, please move to the next slide, please. Okay, here I give you a very quick configuration of how I visualize that the model works. Here I have the market for currency. Here is the division of currency of the total available bullion into currency and bullion. Here you had deposits in coins. In the 2 centuries, there were 32 eponymous bankers, not synchronous. We know their names. They were bankers rather than banks, but they played the role of banks. So Cohen has found 32 eponymous bankers who worked over these 2 centuries by extending credit and receiving deposits and so forth. So we can for sure assume that there was a market for deposits, and there was a market for loans. And loans not only for consumption, but also for production and for financing expeditions to Egypt and Crimea to import cereals, because Athens was in deficit of cereals. So I won't go into any detail into this because it would take much time. I will move on because the issue is how institutionally we can use knowledge from the silver standard of Athens to set up a very viable system of digital currencies. Vasilis, move on to the next slide, please. Okay, money and credit in classical Athens. There were 3 types, 3 components to the money supply in Athens. The one was silver coins. The other was bullion. There were also household silverware and so forth. These you can think of this silver as a part of bullion. And of course, the money was credits, and the loans that the bankers advanced for consumption and investment purposes. And domestic Attica drachmas circulated and competed against all foreign currencies. And the quantity of money was determined endogenously. It was demand and supply. If the price of bullion in terms of goods and services was higher than the price of coins in terms of goods and services, people would convert bullion into currency and vice versa. So it was an environment of perfect competition for many currencies, as it is right now, where you have the Bitcoin, you have the Ethereum, and you have so many other currencies that compete among themselves for the best services that they can offer to owners. Okay, Vasilis, let's go to the next slide. What do we get from this model, the Athenian model? We get a premium historical precedent. The drachma retained its integrity for 300 years. And the drachma played a very crucial role in the achievements of Athens. The drachma was instrumental in helping Athens achieve these marvels that it achieved. Money was produced in private markets. Local and foreign currencies circulated freely in competition. The state established institutions and so forth. And Athens as a state dealt in drachmas. There was no taxation, but Athens dealt in all transactions in Attic drachmas, and of course, for some amounts of money, it could accept bullion. It could pay bullion for imports of cereals. So one could say that Athens was a major player, a major transactor, and because Athens was involved in transacting in the currency, it created, because of its scale, it created the market. It assisted the markets, not only by applying the institutions and setting up the laws and so forth, but also as a everyday transactor in the markets, paying and receiving money. So let's move on to the next slide, Vasilis, please. Okay. What can we learn from this model, the Athenian model of free banking? It was actually a model of free banking. We can say that in the future, the government deals in bitcoins and Bitcoin-denominated banknotes. We adopt what the Athenian state did. The governments in democracies set up the institutions, and also they carry all their transactions in Bitcoin or Bitcoin-denominated banknotes. Once a government imposes this, the Bitcoin will become a reserve currency. And as soon as the Bitcoin becomes a reserve currency, banks and other financial institutions will start providing banknotes and other substitutes of the money. And there is no reason for insisting, as many do, that the supply of Bitcoin or other digital currencies should be elastic to prices. Once a digital currency becomes a reserve currency, then paper money and other substitutes will be created and denominated in Bitcoin and will play the role that all the substitutes of money play today. So financial institutions will be free to issue Bitcoin-denominated notes, as well as any other digital currency of their choice, but without government-imposed convertibility. This should be very, very clear. Okay, Vasilis, let's go on. The government will not issue, you hear a lot about banks, about JP Morgan has issued a currency, a digital currency, which is used within its community. Governments should not issue their own cryptocurrencies. This, if they attempt to do that, they would destroy privacy and citizen sovereignty. And as I said at the beginning, it would be an onerous development, a very risky development for democracy, because freedoms will be destroyed. Therefore, as Athens did at the time, democracies today should not mingle up with cryptocurrencies issuing their own cryptocurrencies. I don't have the time to explain why, but they go back to the information that the governments would collect through the transactions that would be involved through these cryptocurrencies. The same will happen, of course, if cash disappears. Cash is a basis for basic freedoms, personal freedoms. If cash disappears, I am not certain that freedoms, individual freedoms, will survive. Okay, but the government would retain all its prerogatives to enact and enforce rules and regulations for keeping the markets open, combating tax evasion, and, as they do now, and illicit activities, and making sure that the courts respect the contracts and apply the rules and the laws, and that the property rights are safeguarded as best as institutionally possible. I mean, these are basic rights in democracies, and we would like to be preserved through the institutions. Okay, let us move on. Vasilis. Okay, I come to the conclusions. And it is important to draw your attention to this phrase that started me thinking on this paper and on several papers I have done in this area in recent years. In a paper that Friedman and Schwartz wrote back in 1986, they wrote, among other things, the following: if free, private, competitive enterprise can produce a viable money without government, it has yet to do so. This paper was published in the Journal of Monetary Economics, and the title is, Has Government Any Role in Money? And they ended up with this phrase. So at the time they wrote this piece, we didn't know as much as we know today for Athens. In the last 30 years, there is so much literature on ancient Athens, particularly on the economy and the monetary sector of the Athenian democracy, that this literature enables us and my associates to write a book last year, which was published by Rutgers, and the title was Democracy and Money, Lessons for Today from Athens in Classical Times. This book we wrote could not be written without the literature of the last 30 years with focus on the financial institutions in ancient Athens. And therefore, my argument is that yes, private enterprise, there is a precedence. Private enterprise in ancient Athens produced money, private money, on a competitive basis. And the role of the state was to guarantee the integrity of that money with laws and courts and institutions that applied the provisions for the common good. And this is the role of governments in Western-type democracies in the future, if we want personal freedoms and natural rights of individuals to be preserved for the future generations. Okay, let me go to the last slide. Vasilis, let's, okay. The Athenian silver standard offers a very solid, in my view, precedent after which to build a modern Bitcoin-based free banking system. I believe that these currencies are going to, in the next 5-10 years, are going to dominate markets across the world. The governments will face a dilemma, a major dilemma, what to do. The citizens are advised to be aware of the risks in allowing governments to undertake the issue of such currencies. But of course, when these currencies dominate, governments will become more democratic. Why? Because the monetary systems will be completely decentralized and people will feel a lot the gains in their sovereignty. Citizen sovereignty will take a fresh period of survival, because today in democracies a lot of sovereignties, of aspects of sovereignty have been lost. Nick was talking about the loss of sovereignty through the collection of information about our activities by Google and others. This is something we have relinquished either consciously or unconsciously. We have relinquished a lot of aspects of our sovereignty, and including aspects in the money management, the way we manage our money, our savings. It's unbelievable. I will close with this example. When Bolsheviks took over in 1917 in Russia, the first thing they did was to abolish the interest rate. They abolished not only prices, they abolished the interest rate. Now it has taken about 100 years for Western democracies to come to the position of zero or even negative interest rates. 100 years. But negative interest rates imply that savings have become a free good. In markets, everything has a price, a positive price. Even air is not fresh anymore. You pay for fresh air. How is it possible that you pay for keeping your savings? So I think there is a great risk in the management of money the way they are doing presently. And for this reason, I call upon every one of you to start thinking about how we take back this control of money and of the purchasing power of our savings. Otherwise, the road to serfdom is going very near. Thank you very much for hearing me, and I am open to any criticism or any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bitros, for your interesting presentation. We'll have questions by the audience. Who would like to go first?
I have a question. Yeah, I think that's very interesting presentation, and I mean, I don't really know what was happening in ancient Athens, and I have to get better educated about it. But one aspect of the digital currencies right now, for example, Bitcoin, is that although it's widely accepted as a store of value, it's not widely accepted as a means of exchange. I mean, you cannot easily go to Macy's and pay with Bitcoin for various reasons. I mean, so one aspect is how are these various currencies, cryptocurrencies, going to be exchangeable to each other and the traditional fiat money, and to what extent merchants are going to accept them. So that's question number one. Question number two is more of a remark. I think that your theory is good, but I wouldn't stress Bitcoin. Bitcoin has certain inherent deficiencies. Like, for example, the fact that it becomes harder and harder and harder to create new Bitcoin, and therefore, practically speaking, there is an upper limit to currency, and we cannot have a growing economy with a limited amount of currency. So we could refer to another cryptocurrency like Ethereum or something else. But that's kind of a remark. My main question was the previous one. Thank you.
Nick, you remember when Elon Musk started saying that I am going to accept selling Tesla. I'm going to accept Bitcoin. Now, every university in Cyprus accept tuitions paid in cryptocurrencies. I mean, it will take a little bit of time before we get accustomed and to transacting in such currencies. It is still 10 years since they came into play, and I believe in the next 2-3 decades, the advantages of these cryptocurrencies will match the advantages that Professor Seeve talked us about in the advantages of technology in the real estate business. Here you have contactless payments. You have the safety of gold and silver. Now you can lose cryptocurrencies only if you lose the key to your account. I mean, the advantages are very big. I think that they will induce slowly, of course, but because the government plays this predominant role in printing and issuing money, probably the speed of acceptance, the speed of adoption will be slow, but I do not think that the paper money is going to stand there without surrendering to these cryptocurrencies. The paper money, also, mind you, Nick, the government itself does everything to destroy paper money. Everything. I mean, I cannot imagine that presently in the US Congress, they are prepared to adopt a $3.5 trillion budget, which is going to be paid by paper money, issuing paper money. I cannot imagine that the balance of payment of the Federal Reserve has presently $7 trillion in debt. If you add that debt to the debt of the United States, the United States has exceeded the 125% of GDP at which time Greece went to defaulted. If the US did not issue dollar right now, they would be going into default.
Mm-hmm.
So I think eventually the citizens themselves will embrace these currencies, because this development will go hand in hand with with coming back into positive interest rates and in some way preserving the value of savings. Governments cannot go on expending for social programs the savings that all of us do for our rainy days, for our old days. Mm-hmm. So I think that the odds that these currencies will prevail are very, very big, very high.
Are there any other questions you have of Professor Bitros? We want to thank our presenters today, Michael Allen Seeve, Nikolas Economides, and George Bitros, for their very informative presentations on leadership, regulation of high-tech sector, and from the Athenian silver to Bitcoin, the connection that you made. Thank you very much. I know I have learned a lot from all three of you. I appreciate it. And we encourage you to continue with the next session. By the way, there is a panel that starts at 12:45, and they are talking about Bitcoin, if you would like to learn more about it.
Very nice.
Of course, of course.
Thank you all.
Take care.
All the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
See you in 30 minutes.
Okay.
Bitcoin panel discussion.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Edgar, how are you?